Hello, BookTube, and welcome back to our read aloud of Mr. Scarborough's Family by Anthony Trollope. We are embroiled in the story down at Buston, the home of uh, Uncle Prosper, a ridiculous, idiotic dandy of a figure who is the head, basically the chief uh, landholder in the little area of Buston, and has been the North Star of Harry Annesley, our titular hero, the character that Trollope says anyway is the hero of this book. It's uh, it's Uncle Prosper who has told Harry Annesley from when he was a boy that he need not go into a profession, that he need not train for a job. He'll get an allowance of £250 and he will eventually inherit Buston because if he is basically a son to Uncle Prosper will not marry. And so the property will be entailed to Harry. That's the way it's been for years and years. It's just as well because Harry doesn't really have an aptitude for trade and he doesn't have any other source of income, especially now that he wants to marry. He wants to marry Florence Mountjoy. But lately, the simmering tension between him and his uncle has come to a boil. The uncle has never liked the cavalier way that Harry treats him, the lack of respect that he gets from Harry. And now he's heard rumors about what happened between Harry and Mountjoy Scarborough in the city and has decided on drastic action. Not only will he cut off the money, so no more allowance, but also he will no longer see Harry as the heir to Buston, to the house, to the grounds, to the properties, whatnot. He'll no longer see him as an heir to that. Now, the property is entailed. We have seen with Mr. Scarborough himself how cavalierly an entail can be treated. But nevertheless, Uncle Prosper is thinking of getting around the entail the old-fashioned way, which is to have an heir of his own, to marry and have a son. And the number one candidate in the area of Buston that we have been told about is Mrs. Thoroughbung, the aunt of the young brewer who is the fiancée of one of Harry's sisters. And we've heard a lot about her, but we haven't met her. And it's high time that we did. So that's what we're going to do in this chapter. This is chapter 26 called Marmaduke Lodge. On the 7th of next month, two things occurred of great importance. Hunting commenced in the Puckeridge County, and Harry, with that infamous mare Belladonna, was there. And Squire Prosper was driven in his carriage into Buntingford, and made his offer with all due formality to Miss Thoroughbung. The whole household, including Matthew, and the cook, and the coachman, and the boy, and the two housemaids, knew what he was going to do. It would be difficult to say how they knew, because he was a man who never told anything. He was the last man in England who, on such a matter, would have made a confidant of his butler. He never spoke to a servant about matters unconnected with their service. He considered that to do so would be altogether against his dignity. He has a lot of dignity, as you're going to see. Nevertheless, when he ordered his carriage, which he did not do very frequently at this time of year, when the horses were wanted on the farm, and of which he gave 24 hours' notice to all persons concerned, so it's not just a park and a house. It's produce and rents and whatnot. It's a small but competent living in the country. And when early in the morning he ordered that his Sunday suit should be prepared for wearing, and when his aspect grew more and more serious as the hours drew nigh, it was well understood by all that he was going to make an offer that day. He was both proud and fearful as to the thing to be done, proud that he, the Squire of Buston, should be called on to take so important a step, proud by anticipation of his feelings, as he would return home a jolly, thriving wooer. He's just assuming that it will be, and yet a little fearful lest he might not succeed. Were he to fail, the failure would be horrible to him. He knew that every man and woman about the place would know all about it. Among the secrets of the family there was a story, never now mentioned, of his having done the same thing once before. He was then a young man, about 25, and he had come forth to lay himself at Buston at the feet of a baronet's daughter who lived some 25 miles off. She was very beautiful and was said to have a fitting dower. But he had come back, and had shut himself up in the house for a week afterwards. To no human ears had he ever since spoken of his interview with Miss Courtenay. The doings of that day had been wrapped in impenetrable darkness, but all Buston and the neighbouring parishes had known that Miss Courtenay had refused him. Since that day he had never gone forth again on such a mission. What was he like at 25? Probably a lot like Augustus Scarborough, I would think. Uh, there were those who said of him that his love had been so deep and enduring that he had never got the better of it. Miss Courtenay had been married to a much grander lover and had taken off to splendid circles, but he had never mentioned her name. That story of his abiding love was thoroughly believed by his sister, who used to tell it of him to his credit when at the rectory the rector would declare him to be a fool. But the rector used to say that he was dumb from pride, or that he could not bear to have it known that he had failed at anything. At any rate, he had never again attempted love, and had formally declared to his sister that he did not intend to marry. Harry should be regarded as his son. Then at last had come the fellowship, and he had been proud of his heir, thinking that in some way he had won the fellowship himself, as he had paid the bills. But now all was altered, and he went forth to do his wooing again. So when Harry was at school, he won a fellowship, a prestigious fellowship, which does continue to pay him out, but not if he gets married. And since Uncle Prosper was paying the bills for Harry to go to school, he kind of thought that maybe that prestigious fellowship was bestowed on him, because, as we've mentioned, he's a moron. There had been a rumor about the country that he was already accepted. We've already heard that rumor. But such was not the case. He had never even asked. He had fluttered about Buntington, thinking of it, but he had never put the question. To his thinking, it would not have been becoming to do so without some ceremony. Buston was not to be made away with during the turnings of a quadrille or as part of an ordinary conversation. It was not probable, nay, it was impossible, that he should mention the subject to anyone. But still he must visibly prepare for it, and I think he was aware that the world around him knew what he was about. And the Thoroughbungs knew, and Miss Matilda Thoroughbung knew well. All Buntingford knew. In those old days in which he had sought the hand of the baronet's daughter and the baronet's wife and the baronet himself had known what was coming, though Mr. Prosper had thought the secret dwelt alone in his bosom. Nor did he dream now that Harry and Harry's father and Harry's mother and sisters had all laughed at the conspicuous gravity of his threat. A liar! It was the general feeling on the subject which made the rumor current that the deed had been done. But when he came downstairs with one new gray kid glove on and the other dangling in his hand, nothing had been done. "Drive to Buntingford," said the squire. "Yes, sir," said Matthew, and the door of the carriage in his hand. "To Marmaduke Lodge." "Yes, sir." Then Matthew told the coachman, who had heard the instructions very plainly and knew them before he had heard them. The squire threw himself back in the carriage and applied himself to wondering how he should do the deed. He had, in truth, barely studied the words, and not at all the manner of delivering them. With his bare hand up to his eyes, so that he might hold the glove unsoiled in the other, he devoted his intellect to the task, nor did he withdraw his hand till the carriage turned in at the gate. The drive up to the door of Marmaduke Lodge was very short, and he had barely time to arrange his waistcoat and his whiskers before the carriage stood still. He was soon told that Miss Thoroughbung was at home, and within a moment he found himself absolutely standing on the carpet in her presence. So Marmaduke Lodge has a nice name, but there's barely any space between when you get to the gate and when you get to the door, we can infer from that it's not that grand a place, probably a normal house. Report had dealt unkindly with Miss Thoroughbung in the matter of her age. Report always does deal unkindly with unmarried young women who have ceased to be girls. There's an idea that they wish to make themselves out to be younger than they are, and therefore report makes them older. She had been called 45 and even 50. Her exact age at this moment was 42. And as Mr. Prosper was only 50, there was no discrepancy in the marriage. He would have been young-looking for his age, but for an air of ancient dandyism which had grown upon him. He was somewhat dry, too, and skinny, with high cheekbones and large, dull eyes. But he was clean and grave and orderly, a man promising well to a lady on the lookout for a husband. Miss Thoroughbung was fat and fair and 40 to the letter. And she had the just measure of her own good looks, of which she was not unconscious. But she was specially conscious of £25,000, the possession of which had hitherto stood in the way of her search after a husband. It was said commonly about Buntingford that she looked too high, seeing that she was only a Thoroughbung and had no more than £25,000. A staggering amount of money. But Miss Tickle, Miss Tickle is her lady's companion. And if you don't, at the end of this book, wish that you had a Miss Tickle, I don't know what's wrong with you. But Miss Tickle was in the room, and might have been said to be in the way, were it not that a little temporary relief was felt by Mr. Prosper to be a comfort. Miss Tickle was at any rate 20 years older than Miss Thoroughbung, and was of all slaves at the same time the humblest and the most irritating. She never asked for anything, but was always painting the picture of her own deserts. I hope I have had the pleasure of seeing Miss Tickle quite well, said the squire, as soon as he had paid his first compliments to the lady of his love. Thank you, Mr. Prosper, pretty well. My anxiety is all for Matilda. Matilda had been Matilda to her since she had been a little girl, and Miss Tickle was not going now to drop the advantage when the old intimacy gave her. I trust there is no cause for it. Well, I'm not so sure. She coughed a little last night and would not eat her supper. We always do have a little supper. A dispatched crab it was, and when she would not eat it, I knew there was something wrong. Nonsense! What a fuss you make! Well, Mr. Prosper, have you seen your nephew yet? No, Miss Thoroughbung, nor do I intend to see him. The young man has disgraced himself. Dear, dear, how sad. Young men do disgrace themselves, I fear, very often, said Miss Tickle. We won't talk about that, if you please, because it is a family affair. Oh, no, said Miss Thoroughbung. At least not as yet. It may be, but never mind. I would not wish to be premature in anything. He's thinking, it's a family affair now, but maybe you'll be part of my family soon. Then I'll be able to complain about Harry to you. I'm always telling Matilda so. She is impulsive, but you may have matters of business, Mr. Prosper, on which to speak to Miss Thoroughbung. I will retire. It is very thoughtful on your part, Miss Tickle. Then Miss Tickle retired, from which it may be surmised that the probable circumstance of the interview had been already discussed between the ladies. Mr. Prosper drew a long breath and sighed audibly as soon as he was alone with the object of his affections. He wondered whether men were ever bright and jolly in such circumstances. He sighed again, and then he began. Miss Thoroughbung. Mr. Prosper. We've already seen that this kind of a job can be done with a fair amount of spirit. Mr. Anderson did it in Brussels. All the prepared words had flown from his memory. He could not even bethink himself how he ought to begin, and unfortunately so much must depend upon manner. But the property was unembarrassed, and Miss Thoroughbung had thought it probable that she might be allowed to do what she would with her own money. Two important points there. Mercantile, but important points. Buston Place the Buston Hall is unembarrassed. There are no debts. The property has no debts. It's free and clear. And also, Miss Thoroughbung is under the impression that the 25,000 pounds that she brings with her will be under her own disposition. It won't just become her husband's property. She had turned it all over to the right and to the left, and she was quite minded to accept him. With this view, she had told Miss Tickle to leave the room, and she now felt that she was bound to give the gentleman what help might be in her power. Oh, Miss Thoroughbung, he said. Mr. Prosper, you and I are such good friends that... Yes, indeed, you have no more true friend than I, not even Miss Tickle. Oh, bother Miss Tickle. Miss Tickle is very well. Exactly so. Miss Tickle is very well, a most estimable person. We'll leave her alone, just at the present? Yes, certainly. We had better leave her alone in our present conversation. Not but what I have is a strong regard for her. Mr. Prosper had surely not thought of the opening he might be giving to the future career of Miss Tickle by such an assertion. The more nice things you say about her, especially if, as we can easily infer, she's listening, the harder it's going to be to get rid of her. So I have for the matter of that, but we'll drop her just now. Then she paused, and he paused also. You have come over today probably in order that you might congratulate them at the brewery on the marriage of one of your family. Then Mr. Prosper frowned, but she did not care for his frowning. It will not be a bad match for the young lady, as Joshua is fairly steady, and the brewery is worth money. I could have wished him a better brother-in-law, said the lover, meaning Harry, who was taken away with the consideration of his love by the allusion to the Ainsleys. He had thought that of all that, and in the dearth of fitting objects of affection, had resolved to endure the drawback of the connection. But it had been a while weighed very seriously with him, so that the 25,000 pounds, so that had the 25,000 pounds been 20,000 pounds, he might have taken himself to Miss Puffle, who lived near Saffron Walden, and who would own Smickman Manor when her father died. So there's another object. Miss Puffle is another object. The 25,000 pounds means a lot to him. If it were less by even 5,000 pounds, he might have considered not doing this. Why? Because if he marries Miss Thoroughbung, he will be marrying into the Thoroughbung family. It will make him and Harry relatives by marriage. The property was said to be involved, and Miss Puffle was certainly 48. As an heir was a great desideratum. In other words, one of the main things that Uncle Prosper wants is an heir. So a woman who's 48, that's not ideal. He had resolved that Matilda Thoroughbung should be the lady in spite of the evils attending the new connection. He did feel that in throwing over Harry he would have to abandon all the Ansleys and to draw the line between himself and Miss Thoroughbung and the whole family of the Thoroughbungs generally. So a moron, but also a lizard. It's his own sister he's thinking about leaving behind, just severing all connections. You mustn't be too bitter against poor Molly, said Miss Thoroughbung. Mr. Prosper did not like to be called bitter, and in spite of the importance of the occasion, could not but show that he did not like it. I don't think that we need to talk about it. Oh, dear no. Kate and Miss Tickle need neither to be talked about. Mr. Prosper disliked all familiarity, and especially that of being laughed at. But Miss Thoroughbung did laugh. He drew himself up and dangled his glove more slowly than before. Then you are not going to congratulate them on the brewery? Certainly not. I did not know. My purpose carries me no further than Marmaduke Lodge. I have no desire to see anyone today besides Miss Thoroughbung. That is a compliment. Then his memory suddenly brought him back to one of his composed sentences. In beholding Miss Thoroughbung, I behold her on whom I hope I may depend for all the future happiness of my life. He did feel that it had come in the right place. It had been intended to be said immediately after her acceptance of him. But it did very well where it was. It expressed, as he assured himself, the feeling of his heart, and must draw from her some declaration. Goodness gracious me, Mr. Prosper. This sort of coyness was to have been expected, and he therefore continued with another portion of his prepared words, which now came glibly enough to him. But it was a previous portion. It was all the same to Miss Thoroughbung, as it declared plainly the gentleman's intention. If I can induce you to listen to me favorably, I shall say of myself that I am the happiest gentleman in Hertfordshire. He's memorized all this stuff. And not only memorized the words, but memorized where they're going to happen in the exchange. Oh, Mr. Prosper, my purpose is to lay at your feet my hand, my heart, and the lands of Buston. Here he was again going backwards, but it did not matter much now what sequence the words were said. The offer had been thoroughly completed and was thoroughly understood. A lady, Mr. Prosper, has to think of these things, said Miss Thoroughbung. Of course, I would not wish to hurry you prematurely in any declaration of your affections. But there are other considerations, Mr. Prosper. You know about my property. Nothing particularly. It has not been a matter of consideration with me. Lying. In other words, we've just been told that it's a primary consideration of his. That if it hadn't been for the property, he would have gone to someone else. And this is the person who just read the riot act to Harry Annesley for being a liar, for telling a lie. This he said with some slight air of offense. He was a gentleman, whereas Miss Thoroughbung was hardly a lady. Matter of consideration her money, of course, had been. How should he not consider it? But he was aware that he ought not to rush on the subject, but should leave it to the arrangement of lawyers, expressing his own views through her own lawyer. To her it was the thing of most importance, and she had no feelings which induced her to be silent on the matter so near to her. She rushed. But it has to be considered, Mr. Prosper. It is all my own, and comes to very nearly 1,000 a year. I think it is £972, 6 shillings, 8 pence. Of course, when there is so much money, it would have to be tied up somehow. Mr. Prosper was undoubtedly disgusted, and if he could have receded at this moment, he would have transferred his affections to Miss Puffle. Of course you understand that. She's trying to explain the finances. It's the last thing he wants to hear. She had not accepted him as yet, nor said a word of her regard for him. All that went, it seemed, as a matter of no importance. He had been standing for the last few minutes, and now he remained standing and looking at her. They were both silent, so he was obliged to speak. I understand that between a lady and a gentleman so circumstanced there should be a settlement. Just so. I also have some property, said Mr. Prosper, with a touch of pride in his tone. Of course you have. Goodness gracious me! Why else would you come? You've got Buston, which I suppose is 2,000 a year. At any rate, it has that name. But it isn't your own? Not my own. Well, no. You couldn't leave it to your widow, so that she might give it to anyone she pleased when you were gone. Here the gentleman frowned very darkly, and thought that after all Miss Puffle would have been the woman for him. All that has to be considered, and it makes Buston not exactly your own. If I were to have a daughter, she wouldn't have it. No, Not a daughter, said Mr. Prosper, still wondering at the thought of knowledge of business in hands displayed by the lady. Oh, if it were to be a son, that would be all right, and then my money would go to your younger children, divided equally between boys and girls. Mr. Prosper shook his head as he found himself suddenly provided with so plentiful and thriving a family. He's just hoping for the one son. That, I suppose, would be the way of the settlement, together with a certain income out of Buston set aside for my use. It ought to be considered that I should have to provide a house to live in. This belongs to my brother, and I pay him £40 a year for it. It should be something better than this. My dear Miss Thoroughbung, the lawyer would do all that. There did come upon him an idea that she, with her aptitude for business, would not be altogether a bad helpmeet. The lawyers are very well, but in a transaction of this kind there is something like the principals understanding each other. Young women are always robbed when their money is left altogether to the gentleman. Robbed? Well, don't suppose I mean you, Mr. Prosper. The robbery, I mean, is not considered disgraceful at all. The gentlemen, I mean, are the fathers and the brothers and the uncles and the lawyers. They are intended to do right after the custom of their fathers and uncles. The women's rights are coming up. In other words, it's getting a little more fashionable in the 1880s to think about what women's rights are, what their position should be in arrangements of this kind. I hate women's rights, said Mr. Prosper. Big surprise there. Nevertheless, they are coming up. A young woman doesn't get taken in as she used to. I don't mean any offense, you know. This was said in reply to Mr. Prosper's repeated frown. Since women's rights have come up, a young woman is better able to fight her own battle. Mr. Prosper was willing to admit that Miss Thoroughbung was fair, but she was fat also, or at least 40. There was hardly need that she should refer so often to her unprotected youth. I should like to have the spending of my own income, Mr. Prosper. That's a fact. Oh, indeed. Yes, I should. I shouldn't care to have it go to my husband if I wanted to buy a new pair of stockings. An allowance, I should say. And what should be my own income? Nothing to go to the house? Oh, yes, there might be certain things which I might agree to pay for. A pair of ponies I should like. I always keep a carriage and a pair of horses. But the ponies would be my lookout. I shouldn't mind paying for my own maid and the champagne and my clothes and, of course, the fishmonger's bill. There would be Miss Tickle, too. You said you would like Miss Tickle. I should have to pay for her. That should be about enough, I think. Mr. Prosper was thoroughly disgusted. But when he left Marmaduke Lodge, he had not said a word as to withdrawing his offer. She declared that she would put her terms in writing and give them to her lawyer, who would communicate them to Mr. Gray. Mr. Prosper was surprised to find that she knew the name of his lawyer, who was in truth our old friend. And then, while he was still hesitating, she astounded, nay, shocked him, by her mode of ending the conference. She got up, throwing her arms around his neck, kissed him most affectionately. After that, there was no retreating from Mr. Prosper, no immediate mode of retreat, at all events. He could only back out of the room and get into his carriage and be carried home as quickly as possible. That is Mr. Prosper gone a-wooing. And the problem here isn't just that he's an antiquated dandy nincompoop. It's also that he's dealing with Matilda Thoroughbung, who is fat and fair and 40 and has a large amount of money of her own. Has no intention of having that money just become the plaything of some indifferent husband. He talks to him immediately about settlements and properties and allowances and lawyers, which is the last thing in the world that Uncle Prosper wanted when he went a-wooing to a maiden. So that is the disastrous first step in his plan to disinherit Harry, to cut him out of the entail. It didn't go well. We'll see if it continues to go poorly. We'll return to this next time. Thank you, BookTube.